Quote, "Let us eagerly run our course as men called by our God and King, lest, since our time is short, we be found in the day of our death without fruit and perish of hunger. Let us please the Lord as soldiers please their King, because we are required to give an exact account of our service after the campaign. Let us fear the Lord not less than we fear beasts. For I have seen men who were going to steal and were not afraid of God, but hearing the barking of dogs, they at once turned back, and what the fear of God could not achieve was done by the fear of animals. Let us love God at least as much as we respect our friends. For I have often seen people who had offended God and were not in the least perturbed about it. And I have seen how those same people provoked their friends in some trifling matter, and then employed every artifice, every device, every sacrifice, every apology, both personally and through friends and relatives, not sparing gifts, in order to regain their former love." Here, St. John tells us to run quickly, to remember that our time is short and maybe even shorter than we realize it, to please the Lord eagerly like soldiers, pleasing their King, because we will all give an account at the end of our lives of our service here to the King. He tells us also to fear the Lord. Fear is not always bad, and in Scripture we find it's the beginning of wisdom. As human beings, with the human condition, mortal, often suffering, seeing our own weakness, and certainly our weakness in the face of death, fear is a rational posture. And knowing that we didn't create the world we live in, it's a rational thing to ask ourselves and to seek to know who did create this world and how should we react to them. How should we react to our Creator? How should we live in accord with the power that is clearly, as demonstrated by the fact that there are mountains and we can't make mountains? How do we live in accord with the power that is clearly higher than us, than our own power? And then St. John tells us to love God at least as much as we respect our friends. It's easy for us because we have human beings so often physically in front of our eyes to treat them properly and with dignity. And yet, so often we forget to do the same with God, to be faithful to Him and to honor our relationship with Him, simply because oftentimes we can't perceive Him. As we will see going on in St. John's words and in the words of the rest of the holy saints of the Church, it is possible, and it is actually our calling, for us to perceive God as clearly, and in fact more clearly than we perceive the physical world and the people around us. But, at least in the beginning, let us try to hear St. John, who says, think of your friends and try to treat God at least in the same way you treat them. Quote, "In the very beginning of our renunciation, it is certainly with labor and grief that we practice the virtues. But when we have made progress in them, we no longer feel sorrow, or we feel little sorrow. But as soon as our mortal mind is consumed and mastered by alacrity, we practice them with all joy and eagerness, with love and with divine fire." And here we see the reward for our small faith, the small first steps that we take towards God that are difficult. As soon as we take the first few steps, God rushes to our side, taking thousands of steps, descending from heaven, and meets us and carries us. And the sorrow we had at the beginning of our journey is forgotten. And we follow God after that, as St. John says, with all joy and eagerness, with love and with divine fire. Quote, "Let us not even abhor or condemn the renunciation due merely to circumstances. I have seen men who had fled into exile meet the emperor by accident when he was on tour, and then join his company, enter his palace, and dine with him." Here St. John is telling us to beware, not to dishonor or disregard those moments in which we renounce the world from seemingly exterior circumstances, not even because we want to. Perhaps the most common that we find is sickness. Sometimes people are diagnosed with the sickness and immediately start to think of things, of what happens after death, things that perhaps they've never thought of before. Well, we shouldn't dishonor that thought, but we should rather realize that even in what seems to be just a circumstantial interest that someone shows in God, God's hand is there, and He can take that circumstance and turn it into a virtuous turning away from the world and seeking to be close to Him. St. John continues along the same lines, quote, "I have seen seed casually fall on the earth and bear plenty of thriving fruit. And I have seen the opposite too. I have also seen a person come to a hospital with some other motive, but the courtesy and kindness of the physician overcame him, and on being treated with an astringent, he got rid of the darkness that lay on his eyes. Thus for some the unintentional was stronger and more sure than what was intentional in others." Quote, "Let no one, by appealing to the weight and multitude of his sins, say that he is unworthy of the monastic vow, and for love of pleasure disparage himself, excusing himself with excuses in sins. Where there is much corruption, considerable treatment is needed to draw out all the impurity. The healthy do not go to a hospital." Here St. John warns us against one of the temptations that often comes from our own selves and from the passions that we are in love with, the temptation to make an excuse and in false humility to say we're not worthy of following God, or we'll never be able to follow God, and so we should just stay as we are. We're such sinners that there's no point in trying to find freedom. Of course, that's a temptation. And we should all recognize our sickness, and we should see the church, Christ's body on this earth, as a hospital. And the hospital is for us. If we were healthy, we wouldn't be there. Quote, "If an earthly king were to call us and request us to serve in his presence, we should not delay for other orders. We should not make excuses, but we should leave everything and eagerly go to him. Let us then be on the alert, lest when the King of Kings and Lord of Lords and God of Gods calls us to this heavenly office, we cry off out of sloth and cowardice and find ourselves without excuse at the last judgment." As he did just prior, talking about how we treat our friends, so St. John here reminds us and gives flesh and bones, in a way, to our relationship with God. How eager we are and how quickly we would go to serve if some dignitary or important person called us. We would drop everything and run to serve them. And yet, God himself, the creator of all, calls us, and we don't pick up the phone. St. John warns us not to ignore God's call, lest when we do die and when we do all meet him, which inevitably we will, we don't find ourselves without an excuse. Quote, "Some people living carelessly in the world have asked me, 'We have wives and are beset with social cares, and how can we lead the solitary life?' I replied to them, 'Do all the good you can. Do not speak evil of anyone. Do not steal from anyone. Do not lie to anyone. Do not be arrogant towards anyone. Do not hate anyone. Be sure you go to church. Be compassionate to the needy. Do not offend anyone. Do not wreck another man's domestic happiness, and be content with what your own wives can give you. If you behave in this way, you will not be far from the kingdom of heaven.'" And here St. John speaks directly to those who are not monastics, but to those living in the world. And at first glance, it may seem that he's giving them an easier road. He says, as we may be tempted to summarize, simply be a good person. Do what's good. Be compassionate. Be happy with what you have. And it certainly is that simple. But to do these things fully and literally is not so simple. It's a contest of every moment. And so, for all of us living in the world, I'll simply reread St. John's commands and ask that we imagine what it would be like to take these things literally and to live them fully. Quote, "Do all the good you can. Do not speak evil of anyone. Do not steal from anyone. Do not lie to anyone. Do not be arrogant towards anyone. Do not hate anyone. Be sure you go to church. Be compassionate to the needy. Do not offend anyone. Do not wreck another man's domestic happiness. Be content with what your own wives can give you." Continuing on, quote, "Let us charge into the good fight with love and joy, without being afraid of our enemies. Though unseen themselves, they can look at the face of our soul, and if they see it altered by fear, they take up arms against us all the more fiercely. For the cunning creatures have observed that we are scared. So let us take up arms against them courageously. No one will fight with a resolute fighter." Just as we may have learned that dogs can smell fear, and that if we're passing an aggressive dog, we need to maintain a calm posture. How much more so with the demons who, as St. John says, can look at the face of our soul. We must have confidence in our spiritual fight, and that confidence, of course, comes from knowing that we're fighting with God at our side, at our back, and at our front. Quote, "The Lord designedly makes easy the battle of beginners, so that they should not immediately return to the world at the outset. and so rejoice in the Lord always, all servants of his, detecting in this first sign of the Master's love for us, and a sign that he himself has called us. But when God sees courageous souls, he has often been known to act in this way. He lets them have conflicts from the very beginning in order to crown them the sooner. God looks at each of us as we're beginning our spiritual life, and for those of us who need it, in the beginning he gives us easy battles so that we don't grow discouraged. And in here, St. John asks that we sense God's love for us, that he's attentive to where we begin and to our character. And likewise, St. John tells us that when he sees a soul that is courageous, God will allow struggles, difficult struggles, from the beginning, again out of love and out of his desire to see many crowns won, and, as St. John says, to crown the athlete the sooner. Quote, "Offer to Christ the labors of your youth, and in your old age you will rejoice in the wealth of dispassion. What is gathered in youth nourishes and comforts those who are tired out in old age. In our youth let us labor ardently, and let us run vigilantly, for the hour of death is unknown. Let no one, when he is young, listen to his enemies the demons when they say to him, 'Do not wear out your flesh, lest you make it sick and weak.' For you will scarcely find anyone, especially in the present generation, who is determined to mortify his flesh, although he might deprive himself of many pleasant dishes. The aim of this demon is to make the very outset of our spiritual life lax and negligent, and then to make the end correspond to the beginning." Here St. John warns us of another temptation, which is to save our struggle for later and to enjoy our youth, not to spoil the strength of our body when we're younger, but rather to enjoy it and then to tell ourselves that we'll struggle when we're older. Of course, the key, the mechanism of this temptation is to tell us somehow, to convince us that struggling is bad, that wearing out our body is a bad thing. And so the demons, St. John quotes, say, "Don't wear out your flesh, lest you make it sick and weak." If we turn this on its head and realize that it's not a negative, but rather a positive to struggle for God, we can escape this temptation, perhaps, instead of imagining that in fasting and in doing vigil and enduring other hardships out of love for God, instead of imagining that in this way we're weakening and sickening ourselves, our bodies, let's instead recognize the positive. What we're doing is we are polishing our souls. We are preparing our souls and making them more beautiful. And then in our old age, when we can't endure the same hardships and exert the same labor of love for God in a physical way, our soul will rejoice in the peace of knowing him, because these things will have brought us closer to him. They'll have helped us to leave a bit from the world that grabs onto us and to ascend a little to God, to descend a little into our heart, and to recognize that true joy is there. Moving on, quote, "Those who have really determined to serve Christ with the help of spiritual fathers in their own self-knowledge will strive before all else to choose a place and a way of life and a habitation and exercises suitable for them. And here St. John tells us to think about the outside, the exterior elements of our life, where we live, how we live, perhaps what kind of job we have, how we spend our time, what we involve ourselves in, to take all of these things into account, and to strive before all to choose a place that will be suitable for our own advancement, our sanctification, and our journey towards God. It does matter what we do at work. And so, if we are able, let us take these things into consideration, especially in those moments in life, often in our early years of adulthood, where we're making decisions about where we'll live, or what job we'll do, or who we'll spend our time with. Continuing on, quote, "So who is a faithful and wise monk? He who has kept his fervor unabated, and to the end of his life has not ceased daily to add fire to fire, fervor to fervor, zeal to zeal, love to love. This is the first step. Let him who has set foot on it not turn back." And so too let us not turn back. We've read the first step of the 30 steps that St. John of the Ladder offers to us on the renunciation of the world, and we will continue on to step 2 on detachment